Following story is a translated and adapted conversation, recounting supernatural experiences from around the world. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only. Listen with an open mind and enjoy the thrill of the unknown. The content in this video is purely for entertainment. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are easily frightened, be prepared some stories might just send chills down your spine. If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and immerse yourself in the world of the unexplained. The stranger who greeted us. There's a saying in Thailand, not all who greet you are human. Deep in the ancient forests of Thailand, there are tales of spirits who wander the woods, taking on human forms to trick the living. They come at night, their faces friendly, their voices warm, but their eyes are empty. Once you speak to them, you're marked, and once you're marked they will follow you forever. This is the story of a group of friends who met one such stranger, and their lives were never the same again. The sun was setting behind the lush green mountains of Changdao, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold. A group of friends Aom, Jay, Fern, and Ben were on a weekend hiking trip, eager to escape the chaos of city life. Aom, the adventurous one, grinned as she tightened her backpack. This is going to be epic. Jay, always the cautious planner, double-checked the map. We should reach the campsite before dark. Let's keep moving. Fern, cheerful and curious, was snapping photos of the scenic views. These are going to look amazing on my feed. Then, the quiet but reliable friend simply nodded. Let's go. They followed the winding trail, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to whisper as the wind passed through. Birds chirped, and the leaves rustled, creating a symphony of nature. But as they ventured deeper, the forest grew darker, the air colder. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. Fern shivered. Why is it getting so cold? It's supposed to be summer. Aom shrugged, her voice light. We're just high up. Relax, Fern. But Jay's face was tense. We need to hurry. I don't want to be stuck here after dark. Ben glanced around, his eyes narrowing. Feels like we're being watched. They laughed it off, but a chill ran down their spines. The trees seemed to lean in, their twisted branches resembling skeletal arms. The forest felt alive. They finally reached a small clearing just before dusk and set up camp. Aom built the fire, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. There we go. Cozy. They sat around the crackling fire, sharing stories and laughing, their earlier unease forgotten. Fern's voice was playful. Did you guys hear about the ghost stories from this place? Jay groaned. Really, Fern? We're in the middle of nowhere, and you want to tell ghost stories. Fern's eyes sparkled with mischief. They say in this forest there are spirits who take human form. They walk among travelers, pretending to be lost hikers or friendly strangers. Ben rolled his eyes. Nice try. Not buying it. Fern continued, her voice low and eerie. They say if you talk to them, they follow you back home. And at night they stand at your window watching. The wind howled, making the fire flicker. Aom laughed, though her voice was shaky. Enough, Fern. You're just trying to scare us. Fern grinned. Where am I? Suddenly, a rustling noise came from the darkness beyond the firelight. They froze. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man in his 40s, dressed like a hiker. His face was kind, his smile warm. Hello there, he greeted, his voice friendly. Mind if I join you? I got lost and saw your fire. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. Aom spoke first, forcing a smile. Of course, have a seat. The man sat down, his movements fluid, almost too graceful. Jay studied him, his instincts on high alert. Where did you come from? The man's smile never wavered. Oh, just around. Got separated from my group. Lucky I found you. His eyes were too wide, his smile too perfect. But his voice was calm, inviting. Fern whispered to Aom, maybe he's just a lost hiker, right? Aom nodded, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. Yeah, just a normal guy. But Ben was silent, his eyes never leaving the stranger. The fire crackled, the shadows dancing on the man's face. His eyes seemed to glint, reflecting the flames, but his shadow didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, dark and unnaturally sharp. They shared food, the man joining in with laughter and friendly conversation. He seemed charming, polite, his stories fascinating, but something was off. His movements were too perfect, his voice too smooth. He never blinked. Fern asked casually, What's your name? The man paused, his smile freezing for a moment. Oh, you can call me Chai. Jay's eyes narrowed. Chai? Where are you from? The man's smile widened. Oh, just around. I like to wander. A cold breeze blew through the campsite, making the fire flicker. The shadows grew longer, wrapping around the trees like dark vines. The man's shadow it grew too, stretching unnaturally behind him, reaching towards the forest. But no one noticed. No one except Ben. His voice was low, wary. It's late, we should rest. The man's eyes gleamed, his smile widening. Yes, rest. It's safer to sleep together. Fern shivered, hugging herself. Why does that sound creepy? Aom laughed nervously. You're just spooked because of your own ghost stories. But deep down, she felt it too. An unnatural coldness, a presence watching. The man's eyes lingered on each of them, his smile never fading. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes. Soft voices like children giggling. The man's shadow twitched, but his body remained perfectly still. Ben's voice was tense. Let's go to sleep together in the same tent. The man's smile faltered. Oh, afraid of the dark. His eyes gleamed, his teeth to white. Jay forced a laugh. Yes, something like that. They retreated to their tent, their hearts pounding. As they zipped up the entrance, they heard his voice, soft and cold. Good night, friends. The wind howled, and the fire dimmed. From outside the tent, they heard footsteps circling the campsite slowly, deliberately. And then, the man's voice again, closer this time. Good night, friends. Fern whimpered, her body trembling. What is he doing? Aom's face was pale. I don't know. Ben's eyes were fixed on the tent's shadowy fabric. He's waiting. The footsteps circled again, slower this time. Good night, friends. His voice was behind the tent, then beside it, then in front. Good night, friends. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Fern whispered, Is this he gone? A cold, raspy whisper echoed from right outside the tent. Good night, friends. They held their breath, their bodies frozen. The shadow outside the tent, it didn't move. It just stood there waiting. And then it laughed. A cold, hollow laugh that echoed through the forest. The air grew colder, the shadows closing in. The man was still there. Watching. Waiting. And he wasn't human. The friends thought they met a lost hiker by the campfire, a man named Chai with a charming smile and friendly demeanor. But his eyes were too wide, his shadow moved on its own, and his voice echoed in the darkness. That night, his footsteps circled their tent, and his hollow laughter chilled them to the bone. And they realized they weren't alone in the forest. Something was watching, something that wasn't human. The first light of dawn peeked through the fabric of their tent, painting it with soft shades of orange. Aom was the first to wake, her body stiff from a night of restless sleep. She sat up, her eyes heavy with fatigue, and glanced around at her friends. Jay was curled up, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. Fern was huddled close to Aom, her face pale, her lips moving in silent prayers. Ben sat against the tent wall, his eyes wide open, red and bloodshot. He hadn't slept at all. Aom whispered, Did you hear him too? Jay shivered, his voice cracking. He kept circling, whispering, laughing. Fern's eyes welled up with tears. I thought he was going to come inside. Ben's voice was low, hollow. He never left. I heard him standing outside, just breathing. They sat in silence, the memories of the night replaying in their minds. The man's voice, soft and cold. Good night, friends. Aom took a deep breath. We have to check outside. They gathered their courage and unzipped the tent, the sunlight flooding in. The campsite looked normal. The fire was out, the ashes scattered by the wind. Their backpacks and supplies were untouched. But the ground around the tent was covered in footprints. A perfect circle of deep, heavy prints circling the tent over and over again. Jay's voice was shaky. He just kept walking around us. Fern's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground. This can't be real. Ben scanned the forest, his eyes sharp. He's still here. I can feel it. Aom swallowed, her throat dry. We need to leave, now. They packed up quickly, their hands trembling, eyes darting to the shadows. But as they prepared to leave, Fern froze. She pointed to a tree near the campsite, her face pale. Look there. Carved into the bark were words. Good night, friends. See you tonight. The letters were jagged, scratched deep into the wood as if by claws. The air grew cold, the wind whispering through the trees. Aom's voice wavered. Let's go now. They followed the trail back the way they came, their pace quick, desperate to leave the cursed forest behind. But the path felt different, narrower, darker. The trees were closer together, their branches twisted like skeletal arms. Fern whispered, This isn't the way we came. Jay pulled out his map, his hands shaking. It should be, but nothing matches. The trail twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest. Ben gritted his teeth. He's doing this, he's leading us somewhere. Aom's heart raced. We can't stop. We have to keep moving. The forest grew colder, the sunlight barely piercing through the dense canopy. Their footsteps echoed, the sound swallowed by the surrounding silence. No birds, no insects, just silence. And then whispering began. Soft, faint voices echoing through the trees. They couldn't understand the words, but the tone was mocking, taunting. Fern's eyes filled with tears. Make it stop, please. Jay's face was pale, his voice trembling. It's him, he's following us. The whispers grew louder, echoing from all directions. The shadows seemed to move, faces forming within the darkness, their eyes watching, waiting. Aom's head spun, her body cold with fear. Don't listen, just keep walking. But the whispers grew closer, almost breathing down their necks. Good night, friends. They spun around, but no one was there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the endless whispers. They stumbled into a clearing, their legs weak, their hearts pounding. The air was colder here, the ground covered in fallen leaves. In the center of the clearing stood a lone figure facing away from them. The man. His posture was rigid, his head tilted to the side, as if listening to the forest. His clothes were the same as last night, but dirtier, torn. His skin was pale, too pale, like wax. And his shadow, it stretched unnaturally long, reaching towards them like dark claws. Fern whimpered, backing away. No, it's not real. Aom grabbed her arm, her voice low. We have to stay together. Don't let him separate us. The man's head twitched, slowly, his body turned but his head stayed in place. His neck cracked, the sound echoing through the clearing. His face, his smile too wide, too perfect. His eyes were hollow, empty black voids. His mouth moved, his voice echoing from all around them. I told you I'd see you tonight. Jay's body trembled. We talked to him, we're marked. The man's shadow moved, stretching towards them, fingers clawing the ground. His body was still, but his shadow crawled closer. Ben's eyes were wild with fear. Run. They turned and fled, their screams swallowed by the forest. The wind howled, the shadows chasing them, whispering, mocking. Good night, friends. The man's laughter echoed, cold and hollow. His shadow followed them, twisting through the trees. The forest was alive, the paths changing, the shadows laughing. And no matter how far they ran, they could still hear his voice. Good night, friends. Good night, friends. They were trapped. Mark ... And the man would never let them go. Aom, Jay, Fern, and Ben tried to escape the forest, haunted by the man who shouldn't exist. His voice echoed through the trees. His shadow chased them, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. They were marked, cursed. No matter how far they ran, his laughter followed. The forest was changing. The paths were shifting. They were lost. They ran until their legs burned, their lungs aching for air ... Branches scratched their faces, roots tripped their feet, but they couldn't stop. Aom led the way, her eyes wild with fear. Don't look back. Keep going. Fern's sobs echoed through the forest, her hands clutching Aom's backpack. I can still hear him, he's behind us. Jay's face was pale, his voice a whisper. No matter how fast we run, his shadow keeps up. Ben's eyes were wide, his body trembling. We're trapped, he won't let us leave. They stumbled onto a narrow trail, the dirt uneven, covered in fallen leaves. Aom glanced around. This looks familiar. Jay pulled out his map, his hands shaking. It's the same trail, the one we took earlier, but we've been running in circles. Fern's voice broke. How is that possible? Ben's face was pale. He's playing with us, leading us where he wants. A cold wind blew, carrying a faint whisper. Good night, friends, Fern screamed, covering her ears. Make it stop, please. Aom grabbed her shoulders. Stay with me. We can't lose it now. Jay looked at the trees, his voice hollow. They're there watching us. The branches twisted, forming faces within the shadows. Eyes stared down at them, hollow and black. Mouths moved, whispering softly. Good night, friends. Aom's chest tightened. We need to get out of this trail. It's cursed. Ben pointed to a narrow gap between the trees. There, maybe we can cut through. They pushed through the dense foliage, leaves scratching their skin. The forest was darker here, the air colder. But the voices faded, the whispers growing distant. They were finally leaving the cursed path, or so they thought. They stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, abandoned cabin, its wooden walls covered in moss, the windows shattered. Aom's heart sank. This wasn't on the map. Jay's hands trembled. It can't be real. Fern clutched Aom's arm. We shouldn't go near it. Ben's face was pale. But it's shelter, maybe we can hide just until morning. Aom looked at the sky. The sun was setting, the shadows growing longer. They were running out of time. She took a deep breath. We'll check inside. Just to rest for a little while. They approached the cabin, the wooden steps creaking beneath their feet. The door was slightly ajar, hanging off its hinges. Aom pushed it open, the wood groaning. Inside was dark, the air cold and stale. Dust covered the floor, cobwebs hung from the ceiling. It felt abandoned, forgotten. But safe. They collapsed on the floor, their bodies exhausted, their minds frayed. Jay leaned against the wall, his voice shaking. Do you think he can find us here? Aom's eyes were heavy. I don't know, but we needed a break just to catch our breath. Fern curled up next to Aom, her body trembling. I'm scared. I don't want to hear his voice again. Ben sat by the window, staring into the darkness. I'll keep watch, just rest for a bit. Aom's eyelids grew heavy, her body sinking into the cold floor. The cabin was silent to silent. She closed her eyes, the darkness embracing her. But then the whispers returned. Soft at first, faint echoes drifting through the cabin. Aom's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. She looked around. Her friends were asleep, their faces pale, exhausted. But the whispers grew louder, familiar, mocking. The voice echoed through the room, cold and hollow. Aom's body went cold, her hands trembling. No, not here. She turned to Ben, still sitting by the window. Ben, do you hear that? Ben didn't move. His body was rigid, his back turned to her. Aom's stomach twisted. Ben. Slowly his head turned, but his body stayed still. His neck twisted at an unnatural angle, the bones cracking. His face was wrong. His mouth was stretched into a wide, hollow smile. His eyes were black voids, empty and soulless, and his voice wasn't his. Aom screamed, stumbling back. Fern and Jay woke with a start, their faces pale. What's wrong? Aom pointed, her voice shaking. That's not Ben. They looked at him, their bodies freezing in fear. The thing that wore Ben's face stood up, its limbs moving stiffly, unnaturally. It stepped towards them, its shadow stretching, crawling across the floor. Its mouth moved, the voice echoing from the walls. Fern backed away, tears streaming down her face. No, stay away. Jay grabbed a broken piece of wood, his hands trembling. We won't let you take us. The thing's head tilted, the smile growing wider. You already belong to me. Its shadow lunged forward, wrapping around them, cold and suffocating. The room went dark, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Aom's screams echoed through the cabin and were swallowed by the shadows. The last thing she heard was his voice. Good night, friends. Aom, Jay, and Fern sought refuge in the abandoned cabin, but the entity followed. It took Ben, twisted him into something monstrous. His voice was hollow. His eyes were empty. The shadow consumed them. There was no escape. Only darkness and his haunting whisper. Aom's vision blurred, darkness clawing at her. She heard Jay's desperate shouts, Fern's terrified sobs. But Ben, or whatever wore his face, just laughed. You can't leave, not now. His limbs moved unnaturally, cracking and twisting. His shadow stretched, tendrils wrapping around the room, sealing the exits. The air grew colder, the walls groaning. Aom's chest tightened. They were trapped. The cabin wasn't a refuge, it was a cage. Jay swung the broken wood at the creature, let him go. The thing caught it effortlessly, the wood crumbling to dust in its hand. Its face twisted, mocking. Ben's gone, he let me in. Fern collapsed to her knees, her body trembling. Please just let us go, we didn't do anything. The creature's head snapped toward her, its eyes hollow. You heard me, you saw me, now you belong to me. Aom's mind raced, her heart pounding. There had to be a way out. She grabbed Fern's arm. We have to fight, we can't give up now. Jay's voice was hoarse. How do we fight something like this? Aom's eyes locked on the shadow, writhing and crawling. It's using the darkness, we need light. She pulled out her flashlight, the beam flickering. Together we shined them all at once. Jay and Fern nodded, hope flickering in their eyes. They aimed their flashlights, hands shaking. Aom's voice was firm. Now. The beams pierced the darkness, bright and blinding. The shadow recoiled, hissing. The creature's face twisted, the smile vanishing. Its body convulsed, limbs bending backward. No, you can't escape. The light burned the shadows, the tendrils retreating. The cabin shook, the walls creaking. Cracks appeared, light seeping through. Aom's heart raced. It's working, keep going. They pushed forward, the light growing stronger. The creature's body flickered, its form unstable. It shrieked, the sound piercing. I won't let you go, you're mine. Aom gritted her teeth. You have no power in the light, now leave. Their flashlights blazed, the cabin flooding with light. The creature screamed, its body shattering into shadows, scattering like smoke. The walls trembled, the shadows melting away. The air grew lighter, the cold fading, then silence. They collapsed to the floor, their bodies exhausted, their breaths ragged. The cabin was empty, the shadows gone, but Ben was nowhere to be found. Fern's voice cracked. He's really gone. Aom's chest tightened, tears welling in her eyes. We couldn't save him. Jay's shoulders trembled. He was gone the moment we met that thing. They stood in silence, the weight of loss heavy. Aom wiped her tears, her voice trembling. We need to leave before it returns. They stumbled out of the cabin, the forest quiet, the air warm. The sun was rising, golden light filtering through the trees. It felt safe, peaceful. They followed the trail, the path clear, leading them out of the forest. But as they reached the edge, Fern stopped, her body freezing. Aom turned. Fern, what's wrong? Fern's face was pale, her eyes wide. She pointed back to the tree line. A figure stood there. Tall and still, a man with hollow eyes and a wide smile. He raised his hand, waving slowly. And his voice echoed through the air. Good night, friends. The whisper lingered, carried by the wind. Aom's heart stopped, her blood running cold. Jay grabbed her arm. Don't look back, just keep walking. They turned away, their bodies trembling. They never spoke of that night again. But every now and then, when the wind was just right, they heard him. His voice, soft and mocking. Good night, friends. They never camped in the forest again, and Ben was never found. The tent that unzipped itself. There are places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead is thin. Places where ancient spirits linger, where the past refuses to let go. Deep in the jungles of northern Thailand, among the dense trees and echoing whispers, one such place lies hidden. A place known to locals as Falwang, the Great Cliff. A place cursed by the spirits of those who never left. And a place where the living are not always alone even inside their tents. This is the story of 4 friends who dared to camp there. And the night their tent unzipped by itself. The morning sun was bright, golden light filtering through the canopy above. The forest was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. Beam adjusted his backpack, sweat glistening on his forehead. How much farther, Nate? Nate glanced at the map, his brows furrowing. Not far. The campsite should be just beyond that hill. Lisa shielded her eyes, squinting at the distant cliff. That's Falwang, it's massive. Pat shivered, his voice uneasy. Looks eerie, like it's watching us. Beam laughed, slapping Pat's shoulder. You watch too many horror movies. Nate grinned. Well, the locals did say it's haunted. Something about spirits wandering the cliffside. Lisa rolled her eyes. They always say that. It's just a story to scare tourists. Pat's face was pale. What kind of spirits? Nate shrugged. They say it's the souls of those who lost their way. Climbers who fell and never left. Beam scoffed. Yeah. And they open tents in the middle of the night, right? Lisa laughed, but her eyes flicked nervously to the towering cliff. Let's just set up camp before it gets dark. Beam, the fearless leader, always charging ahead. But beneath his bold exterior, a protective heart beats, always looking out for his friends. Nate, the planner, logical and cautious. Yet his curiosity drives him to explore the unknown, even when danger lurks. Lisa, the skeptic, never believing in ghosts. But her laughter hides a fear she won't admit, a fear of things she can't understand. Pat, the sensitive one, easily spooked but fiercely loyal. He senses things the others don't, feelings he can't explain. For friends, for hearts, bound by friendship and now, by the curse of Falwang. The sun dipped below the horizon, shadows lengthening as the sky turned shades of purple and gold. The air grew colder, a chill breeze whispering through the trees. The friends gathered around the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light. Beam grinned, his voice loud and confident. See, nothing spooky, just another campsite. Nate stretched, his eyes scanning the darkening forest. Yeah, just us and the wildlife. Lisa laughed. And maybe a few ghosts. Pat shivered, his eyes wide. Not funny, Lisa. Lisa rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, there's no such thing as ghosts. Nate glanced at his watch. Let's get some rest. We'll explore the cliff tomorrow. They crawled into their tents, zipping them up tightly. The forest was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. But the air felt heavy, cold like eyes were watching. Pat lay awake, his heart pounding. Did you hear that? Lisa groaned. Go to sleep, Pat. It's just the wind. But Pat wasn't so sure. Something was out there watching. The night grew darker, the forest wrapped in shadows. The wind howled softly, a whispering sound that danced through the trees. Beam stirred in his sleep, his dreams restless. A faint sound, a soft zipping noise. His eyes fluttered open, his heart pounding. Nate, silence. The faint sound came again, a slow, deliberate unzip. Beam sat up, his breath fogging in the cold air. His tent zipper was slowly moving on its own. His blood ran cold. Who's there? No answer. The zipper continued, inch by inch, the cold air seeping inside. Beam's heart raced, his body frozen in fear. He scrambled backward, his eyes wide. Nate, Pat, Lisa, the zipper stopped. The tent flap hung open, swaying in the breeze. Beyond it darkness, empty, silent, waiting. Beam's voice trembled. Who did that? The wind howled, a cold whisper swirling around him. The darkness outside seemed to shift, shadows moving. Beam's heart pounded, his body trembling. This isn't real, it's just the wind. But the air grew colder, the darkness pressing closer. And then, a whisper, soft, faint, echoing through the night. Come out. Beam's blood ran cold. The voice was right outside his tent, a voice that wasn't human. A voice that was waiting just beyond the zipper. In the heart of the cursed forest of Falwang, Beam woke to the sound of his tent unzipping by itself. Cold air crept in, shadows shifting outside. And then, a whisper echoed through the night, come out. Fear gripped him, the darkness pressing closer. He wasn't alone. The morning sun bathed the campsite in golden light, the forest alive with birdsong. Beam stumbled out of his tent, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. Nate looked up from the campfire, frowning. You look like you saw a ghost. Beam's voice shook. Last night my tent unzipped by itself. Lisa laughed, rolling her eyes. Seriously, Beam? Maybe you didn't zip it properly. Beam's hands trembled. No, it was closed. I checked. And I heard a voice. Pat's face went pale. A voice, Beam nodded. It said come out. Nate's eyes narrowed. That's creepy. Are you sure you weren't dreaming? Beam shook his head. I wasn't asleep. I was wide awake. Lisa crossed her arms. Look, this place is eerie, sure, but there's no such thing as ghosts. Pat whispered, his voice trembling. My tent was shaking last night, like something was outside. Lisa's eyes widened. Wait, you two. Nate's face darkened. Alright, that's weird. Beam glanced around the clearing, his heart racing. We need to be careful. Something is watching us. The wind rustled the leaves, a cold breeze sweeping through the camp. The forest seemed to whisper, the shadows deeper than before. And the cliff of Falwang loomed above them, silent, watching. As they cleaned up the campsite, Nate stopped, his face going pale. Guys, come look at this. The others hurried over, their eyes widening. Around the tents, in the dirt, were footprints. Small, human footprints circling each tent. Beam's heart skipped a beat. No one left their tent last night, right? Lisa's face turned white. Then who made these? The footprints were delicate, almost childlike. And they circled each tent over and over again. Pat whispered, his voice shaking. They're barefoot. Nate's jaw tightened. No one else is out here. I checked the trail. We're the only ones who came this way. Beam's voice wavered. Then who or what was walking around our tents? The forest was silent, the trees towering above them. The shadows seemed to deepen, the air growing colder. And the wind whispered through the branches, a soft, eerie sound. Pat shivered. We should leave. Nate shook his head. No. We came here to see the cliff. We're not running because of footprints. Beam swallowed hard. Let's stick together. No one goes off alone. Lisa's eyes were wide, her bravado gone. Agreed. But as they packed up their gear, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The shadows seemed to move, shifting among the trees. And in the distance, from the direction of the cliff, a soft voice echoed, whispering, calling, "Come out." They followed the narrow trail through the dense forest, branches scratching at their arms. The air was cold, the wind whispering through the trees. Pat's voice was low. "I don't like this. It feels wrong." Bean glanced back, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Stay close. We're almost there." Lisa shivered, hugging herself. "It's freezing. Why is it so cold?" Nate checked his watch, frowning. "It's the middle of the day. It shouldn't be this cold." The forest grew darker, the trees towering above them. The wind grew stronger, swirling around them, carrying a faint whisper. "Come out." Pat stopped, his face pale. Did you hear that?" Beam's heart raced. "Yeah, I heard it." Nate's eyes were wide. Who said that?" Lisa's voice trembled. "There's no one else here, right?" The whisper echoed through the trees, cold and haunting. Pat's hands were shaking. It had sounded like a child. Beam's jaw tightened. "Keep moving. Don't look back." But the whisper grew louder, the words clearer. "Come out, come play." Lisa's eyes were wide with fear. Who's saying that?" Nate's face was pale. "I don't see anyone." Pat's voice cracked. It's coming from everywhere." The trees seemed to close in, the shadows shifting. Beam's voice was firm. "Don't stop. Just keep walking." But the whisper followed them, echoing through the forest. A voice that was playful, innocent, and cold. "Come play with me." Pat choked back a sob. No, I don't want to." The shadows moved, shapes flickering at the corners of their eyes. Lisa's voice was trembling. "Beam, what's happening?" Beam's face was pale. "We need to get to the cliff. We need to get out of here." The whisper grew louder, the voice echoing through the trees. A voice that didn't belong to any living child. A voice that was waiting, calling, "Come play forever." Beam, Nate, Lisa, and Pat ventured deeper into the cursed forest of Falwang, haunted by whispers and mysterious footprints. A voice echoed through the trees, playful and chilling, "Come play forever." With shadows closing in, they raced towards the cliff, desperate to escape the haunting presence. But the spirits weren't done with them yet. They emerged from the dense trees onto the rocky ledge of Falwang Cliff. The view was breathtaking, the valley stretching out below, blanketed in mist. But the air was icy, a cold wind howling past them. Beam shivered, rubbing his arms. "Why is it so cold up here?" Nate scanned the area. "This place, it feels wrong." Lisa stepped closer to the edge, her eyes wide. "Look, there are carvings on the rocks." Pat's voice trembled. What did they mean?" The ancient symbols were scratched into the stone, spiraling around the cliff's edge. Beam's face went pale. These are protection symbols. To keep something in, Nate's jaw tightened. Or to keep something out. The wind grew stronger, swirling around them, carrying that familiar whisper, "Come play." Lisa's face drained of color. It's here." Pat stumbled back, his voice shaking. We need to get out of here." But the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumbling echoing from the cliffside. The mist below began to rise, swirling upwards, taking shape. A figure emerged. A childlike silhouette, featureless, made of shadows and fog. Its voice was playful, echoing through the air. "Come play with me," Lisa screamed, stumbling back. No, this can't be real." Nate pulled her away from the edge. "Stay together, don't look at it." But Pat was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. It's looking at me." The shadowy figure tilted its head, the whispering voice cold and innocent. "Play forever." Beam grabbed Pat's arm, shaking him. "Pat, snap out of it. But Pat's face was blank, his body rigid. His lips moved, echoing the voice, "Forever, forever." The shadows swirled around him, wrapping around his body like tendrils. Lisa screamed. "No, Pat!" Beam lunged forward, grabbing Pat's arm. "Hold on, I won't let go." The shadowy figure's whisper grew colder, the air freezing around them. "Mine forever." Pat's eyes turned black, his voice hollow. It wants me, I can't." His body jerked, pulled towards the edge by the shadowy tendrils. Nate grabbed Beam, his voice urgent. "We can't save him, we need to go." Beam's eyes were filled with tears. "No, Pat, please." Pat's face softened for a moment, his eyes returning to normal. "Beam, run, don't look back." And then the shadows pulled him over the edge. Pat's scream echoed through the valley, swallowed by the mist below. Lisa collapsed, sobbing. No, this isn't happening." Nate's face was pale, his fists clenched. "We need to leave now." Beam stood frozen, staring at the cliff's edge. It took Pat. The shadowy figure remained, standing at the cliff's edge, its head tilted in curiosity. Its voice echoed, cold and mocking, "Come play forever." The symbols on the rocks glowed faintly, pulsing with ancient energy. But the shadow didn't retreat. It took a step closer. Beam's heart raced. "It's coming for us." Nate pulled him back. "We need to break the curse. We need to end this before it takes us all." Lisa looked at the ancient carvings, her voice trembling. "These symbols, they're meant to bind it here." Beam's eyes widened, "But they're fading." The wind howled, the shadowy figure drawing closer. Its whisper was relentless, echoing through the air. "Come play forever." Nate's jaw tightened. "We need to restore the symbols. It's the only way to seal it." Beam looked at his hands, his fingers trembling. "But how?" Lisa's voice was low. "There's only one way, blood. It needs a sacrifice." The shadowy figure's laughter echoed, cold and hollow. Beam's face was pale. "Then one of us has to stay." Nate's eyes were wide. "No, we're not leaving anyone behind." The shadow's whisper grew louder, its tendrils reaching out. "Play with me forever." Lisa's voice shook. "It wants a playmate. It wants a soul." Beam looked at the cliff's edge, his heart pounding. It took Pat. Nate's eyes were fierce. "Then we end this for Pat." The shadows swirled, the air growing colder. The ancient curse was awakening. And the spirits were hungry. Beam, Nate, and Lisa stood on the edge of Falwan Cliff, facing the shadowy figure that had taken Pat. The ancient symbols meant to seal the curse were fading, their power weakening. The shadows drew closer, cold and relentless, whispering, "Come play forever." To end the curse, a soul must be sacrificed. But who would make the ultimate choice? The air grew colder as the shadowy figure floated closer, its tendrils reaching out. Beam's heart raced. "It's coming for us." Nate's face was pale but determined. "We end this, now." Lisa looked at the glowing symbols on the rocks. "We need to restore them with blood." Beam's eyes widened. "Blood? But whose?" The shadow's voice was playful, echoing around them. "Come play forever." Nate's jaw tightened. "It took Pat and it won't stop until it has us all." Lisa's face was pale, her hands trembling. "It needs a playmate, it needs a soul." Beam's eyes filled with tears. "Pat, he tried to warn us." The shadowy figure's head tilted, its voice cold and mocking. "Pat is mine forever." Nate clenched his fists. "No. We're not leaving him." Lisa looked at the symbols, her voice cracking. We can seal it, but one of us has to stay." Beam's face turned pale. "Stay, but that means..." The shadow's laughter echoed, the tendrils swirling around them. "Play with me forever." The ground trembled, the cliff's edge crumbling beneath them. Nate's eyes were fierce. "We end this. For Pat." Beam looked at his friends, his heart breaking. "Then one of us has to be the sacrifice." Lisa's tears flowed. I can't do it." Nate's face softened. "No one should have to." The shadow's voice grew colder, more demanding. "One must stay." Beam's eyes were filled with determination. "I'll do it." Lisa's face turned white. "No, Beam, you can't." Beam smiled, his eyes sad but resolute. "Pat saved me back there. If it wasn't for him, I would have been taken." Nate's voice cracked. "Beam, don't." Beam stepped towards the symbols, his hands trembling. If I do this, you two can escape." Lisa sobbed. "No, we can't lose you two." Beam looked at the shadowy figure, its tendrils reaching out. This thing, it wants someone to play with, someone to keep it company forever." The shadow's whisper was soft, almost gentle. Come play forever. Beam took a deep breath. If I give myself to it, the curse will be sealed and you'll be safe. Nate grabbed his arm. No, there has to be another way. Beam's eyes were filled with tears. I'm not as strong as you. Nate, I'm not as brave, but I can do this, I can save you. Lisa's voice was broken. Beam, please don't go. The shadows wrapped around his body, cold and heavy. Beam looked at his friends, his voice shaking. Tell my family, I'm sorry. Double quotes. Nate's eyes were wide with horror. No, Beam, don't. Beam smiled through his tears. Take care of each other and live for me. The shadows pulled him closer to the cliff's edge, his body surrounded by darkness. His voice echoed, soft and distant, goodbye. The ancient symbols glowed brightly, the ground shaking as the curse was restored. The shadowy figure's voice was playful and innocent. Forever mine, forever. Beam's body vanished into the mist, his scream echoing through the valley. The symbols pulsed with light, sealing the curse once more. The shadows retreated, the air growing warm again. Nate and Lisa collapsed, sobbing, the weight of their loss crushing them. The wind whispered softly, a familiar voice echoing. Goodbye, my friends. They looked up, seeing Beam's silhouette standing at the cliff's edge, his face peaceful. He smiled one last time before fading into the mist. The curse was sealed, but Beam was gone, forever. Months later, Nate and Lisa returned to the village, broken but alive. They told the elders about the curse, about Pat and Beam's sacrifice. The shaman nodded sadly. The spirits are cruel. They demand a soul to seal the darkness. Lisa's voice trembled. Will they ever be free? The shaman looked at the mountains, his eyes distant. Their spirits are bound to protect the living from the shadows. Nate's fists clenched. They saved us, but they're trapped forever. The shaman placed a hand on Nate's shoulder. Honor them by living, by remembering their sacrifice. They looked up at Falwang Cliff, the mist swirling gently. A cold wind blew past them, carrying a whisper. Goodbye, my friends. Tears flowed as they stood in silence, mourning their friends. The shadows were sealed, but the wind would always whisper, and the spirits would always watch, forever. Whispers from the depths. In the heart of Thailand's ancient rainforests, there is a legend one whispered from generation to generation. They call it the call from the deep forest. It is said that the spirits of the lost wander those woods, calling out the names of the living, mimicking voices of loved ones. Those who answer are never seen again, but curiosity is a powerful thing. And sometimes curiosity leads you to places you were never meant to go. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows that danced along the moss-covered ground. It was beautiful and haunting. Perfect for an adventure. Are we sure about this? Asked Nate, his voice tinged with unease as he tightened the straps on his backpack. His messy hair and carefree grin usually masked his anxious nature, but not today. Floyd, the boldest of the group, smirked. Come on, Nate. Scared of a little hike? It's just a forest. Win, always the logical one, adjusted his glasses and shrugged. According to the locals, it's more than just a forest. They say it's cursed. Lena rolled her eyes, flicking her ponytail over her shoulder. You believe in that superstitious nonsense. Win shook his head. I'm just saying we should be careful. People have gone missing here. Ploy scoffed. Missing because they got lost, not because of ghosts. Nate glanced at the dense thickets. Still, let's stick together, just in case. With that, they set off, laughter and banter echoing as they made their way deeper into the forest. They were here for adventure, for the thrill of the unknown. But the forest was listening, and it was waiting. As the sun dipped lower, the group took a break near an ancient tree, its roots sprawling like a web across the ground. Wynn pulled out his phone, scrolling through an article. Listen to this, the call from the deep forest, an old Thai legend. They say if you hear someone calling your name in these woods, you must never answer. Lena snorted. Let me guess, it's some ghost story to scare kids. Wynn continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They believe the spirits of the lost mimic voices, people you know, even loved ones. They call out, luring you deeper into the woods. And once you follow. He looked up, his eyes serious. You never come back. Ploy laughed. That's ridiculous. Just a story to keep people out of the forest. Nate shifted uncomfortably. Still, let's not get separated. The wind rustled through the branches, a soft murmur drifting past them. It sounded almost like a whisper. They didn't notice, but the forest did. Dusk settled, casting the forest in shades of amber and gold. Shadows stretched, twisting into eerie shapes. They reached a clearing and set up camp, pitching their tents and gathering firewood. Lena hummed a tune, her voice echoing softly as she arranged the logs. Wind started the fire, the flames crackling, sending sparks dancing into the sky. Nate shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. "It's colder than I thought." Ploy grinned, getting scared already. Before he could reply, a sound echoed through the trees. "Nate." A soft whisper, faint, almost fragile. Nate's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Did you guys hear that?" Lena frowned. "Hear what?" He looked around, his heart racing. Someone called my name." Ploy rolled her eyes. "Seriously? Stop being paranoid. It's just the wind." But Nate was certain. It was a voice, a whisper. He stared into the shadows, the trees swaying gently. "Nate." There it was again. Clearer this time. Lena's face paled. "Okay, I heard that." Wind stood up, his voice tense. "We should stay close. Don't wander off." Chloe tried to laugh it off, but her voice wavered. Probably just some local playing tricks. But Nate's eyes were locked on the darkness. The voice, it sounded familiar. It sounded like his sister, but she was miles away. At home, safe, wasn't she? The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across their faces. An uneasy silence hung over the group, broken only by the rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Nate sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. His heart was still pounding, the voice echoing in his mind. It sounded just like her, his little sister. The playful tone, the way she stretched his name. But she wasn't here. She couldn't be here. Ploy forced a laugh, trying to break the tension. "All right, joke's over. Who's messing with us?" Wynn adjusted his glasses, his face pale. "No one's out there. We're miles from the nearest village." Lena hugged her knees, her eyes darting around. Maybe it was just the wind." Nate shook his head. "No, it was clear. Someone called my name. Twice." Silence fell again. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, Ploy. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Ploy's face went white. No way. It was her father's voice, soft, familiar. But he was in Bangkok, running his shop. He couldn't be here. The group huddled closer to the fire, the flames dancing wildly as the wind picked up. Lena gasped, clutching Wynn's arm. "Who's out there? Show yourself." Her voice cracked, panic setting in. But there was no answer, only shadows, and the whispers. Wynn's face was grim. "It's just like the legend, the call from the deep forest. The spirits mimic voices of people you know to lure you deeper." Ploy shivered, hugging herself. "That's just a story, it can't be real." Wynn looked into the darkness, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then how do they know our names?" The question hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. No one had an answer. The wind howled, swirling around them. For a moment, it almost sounded like laughter. Lena stood up, her fists clenched. "Enough of this. I'm not sitting here waiting for some ghost to scare us. I'm going to look around." Nate grabbed her arm. "Are you crazy?" "We need to stay together." Ploy hesitated, her bravado fading. Maybe we should just leave." Wynn shook his head. "It's too dark. We'll get lost. We wait till morning." Lena's eyes flashed defiantly. "Then we at least figure out who's doing this. It's probably just some stupid prank." Before anyone could stop her, she grabbed her flashlight and marched toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing gnarled roots and twisted branches. Shadows danced, taunting her. "Lena, wait." Ploy called, but Lena didn't look back. The whispers started again, drifting through the trees like a ghostly breeze. "Lena." She froze, the voice so close it sent chills down her spine. It was her mother's voice, gentle, worried. The same tone she used whenever Lena was out too late. "Mom." Lena's voice shook. "Mom, is that you? Come here, Lena." Her legs moved on their own, taking slow steps toward the darkness. Nate yelled, "Lena, don't." But she kept walking, the flashlight trembling in her grip. The others rushed after her, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser, their branches intertwining above. The voices grew louder, overlapping, calling out to each of them. Nate, Ploy, Win. Each voice familiar, each one laced with urgency. The group huddled together, eyes wide, breaths coming in sharp gasps. Ploy was shaking. It had sounded like my dad. He said he needed help. Nate's voice cracked. My sister, she called for me. Like she was lost. Win clenched his fists, his face pale. This is impossible, this can't be real. Lena stared into the darkness, her eyes glazed. I saw her, my mom, she was standing right there. Chloe grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. No, it wasn't real. It's the forest, it's playing tricks on us. But Lena's gaze remained fixed on the shadows. I need to find her. She pulled away and ran into the darkness. Lena, Nate shouted, rushing after her. The others followed, the whispers growing louder, echoing from every direction. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the path twisting and turning, leading them deeper and deeper. Chloe stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She fell hard, pain shooting up her leg. Win helped her up, his voice trembling. We were lost. Nate looked around, panic setting in. No, we just came from that way. But the path was gone. Only trees surrounded them, towering and ominous. And the whispers, they were closer now, circling them, mocking them, calling them by name. The darkness was suffocating. Trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches interlocking like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Nate's heart pounded as he stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scratching at his arms and face. Lena, where are you? His voice echoed, swallowed by the endless expanse of trees. No answer came, only the whispers. Nate, this way. His blood ran cold. It was Mai's voice again, his little sister. The playful, teasing lilt she always used when they played hide and seek. But Mai was miles away, safe at home. Come find me, Nate. He stopped, his legs trembling. It was so clear, so real. He could almost see her tiny figure darting behind the trees, her pigtails bouncing as she giggled. No, it's not her. It's not real. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping his flashlight tightly. A hand touched his shoulder. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But no one was there. His chest tightened, his breath hitching. The whispers were all around him now, echoing off the trees, swirling in the cold air. Nate, don't leave me. His heart shattered. It was Mai's voice, trembling, scared. Just like when she got lost at the market years ago. I am coming. He ran, his legs moving on instinct, chasing the voice deeper into the forest. Meanwhile, Ploy and Win huddled together, their backs against a massive tree, eyes wide with terror. Ploy was shaking uncontrollably, her tears glistening in the flashlight beam. This can't be happening, it can't. Win held her tightly, his own fear barely under control. Stay with me. We'll find Nate and Lena, we just need to stay together. But Ploy's eyes were distant, unfocused. He called for me. My dad, he said he was hurt, he needed me. Win shook his head. It's not real. It's the forest. It's messing with our minds. Win. His heart dropped. That voice so familiar, so heart-wrenching. Win, why did you leave me? His blood ran cold. It was his grandmother's voice, the one who raised him, the one he couldn't say goodbye to before she passed. Chloe looked up, her face pale. Did you hear that? Win's eyes were wide, his body rigid. No, it's not her, it's not. But the voice grew louder, closer. Win, come back to me. His knees buckled. The pain of regret surged through him, raw and unrelenting. He could almost see her frail figure standing just beyond the tree line, her arms open, waiting for him. Tears streamed down his face. Grandma, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Chloe grabbed his arm, shaking him. Win, no, it's not her. Snap out of it. But his eyes were locked on the darkness, his feet moving forward, drawn by the voice. Win, don't go, Chloe screamed. But he was already slipping away, his body moving like he was in a trance. She chased after him, her flashlight flickering as she stumbled over roots and fallen branches. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees warping and shifting, twisting into haunting shapes. Chloe, she stopped dead in her tracks. That voice so familiar, so warm. Her father's voice, Ploy, come home, I miss you. Her knees went weak, her heart aching. She could almost see him standing in the shadows, his gentle smile, his outstretched hand. Dad, her voice wavered, her body moving toward him. Meanwhile, Nate stumbled through the undergrowth, the voice leading him deeper, his sister's laughter echoing through the trees. He reached a clearing, the moonlight revealing a massive, ancient tree standing alone. Its twisted branches stretched toward the sky, gnarled roots coiled like serpents around its base. And there, at the foot of the tree, stood a little girl. Her back was turned, her hair long and dark, flowing down her back. Nate's heart raced. She didn't move, her figure motionless in the moonlight. He stepped closer, his voice trembling. Is it really you? The girl's head tilted, slowly, unnaturally. Her neck creaked as her face turned just enough for him to see the corner of her mouth. Her lips twisted into a smile, a cold, hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes. Nate's blood ran cold. He stepped back, his flashlight shaking. No, you're not. The girl's body twitched, her limbs bending at unnatural angles. Her head turned fully now, revealing hollow eyes, black and void, staring right at him. The smile widened, stretching impossibly across her face. Nate's scream echoed through the forest, swallowed by the darkness. Ploy and Win were lost, their flashlights flickering as they stumbled through the labyrinth of trees. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, taunting them. Faces appeared in the shadows, twisted and distorted, eyes hollow and empty. Figures moved between the trees, their limbs contorting, their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. Win fell to his knees, his body shaking. I can't, it's too much. Ploy pulled him up, her own fear threatening to consume her. We have to keep moving, we have to find Nate and Lena. But the forest was alive, shifting, twisting, trapping them in its maze. The voices were relentless, calling their names, luring them deeper. There was no way out, only shadows. The forest was alive. It breathed, sighed, and whispered, the air heavy with a sense of mourning and malice. Branches creaked, the wind weaving through them like a mournful wail. Shadows danced, distorted and elongated, moving with a life of their own. Ploy and Win stumbled through the labyrinth of trees, their flashlights dimming, the batteries faltering. Panic surged through them as the shadows grew thicker, pressing in, suffocating. Win's breaths were ragged, his eyes wide with terror. We're never getting out of here, are we? Ploy gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay strong. Don't say that. We're getting out. We have to find Nate and Lena and then we'll leave, together. But the forest seemed to laugh at her defiance, the whispers echoing around them, mocking, relentless. You'll never leave. They turned, their flashlights shaking. Faces flickered between the trees, hollow eyes, twisted smiles. Familiar faces. Ploy's heart dropped. No, that's impossible. One of the faces stepped forward, its body warped and translucent, its feet hovering above the ground. It was Lena. Her skin was pale, her eyes empty, her mouth curled into a cold, unnatural smile. Ploy, why did you leave me? Ploy's knees buckled, tears streaming down her face. No, Lena, I didn't. I was looking for you. The figure's head tilted, its neck cracking. You left me, you didn't save me. Win pulled Ploy back, his voice trembling. It's not her, it's not real. But then another figure emerged from the shadows. Nate. His body twisted, his limbs contorted, his eyes hollow. His voice echoed, cold and distant. When you promised we'd always stick together. Win's face went pale, his body trembling. Nate, no, I tried to find you. But Nate's face twisted into a smile, his eyes darkening. Liar. His body convulsed, his mouth stretching impossibly wide as a chorus of voices spilled out, overlapping, distorted. Stay with us forever. The air grew colder, the darkness thickening as the shadows surrounded them. Ploy and Win huddled together, their backs against each other, flashlights flickering. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Figures began to form, emerging from the shadows, their faces blank, their eyes empty. Ploy's eyes widened in horror. Who are they? Win's voice was hollow. The lost, all the people who followed the whispers, who never found their way out. The figures moved closer, their limbs bending unnaturally, their faces twisting into grotesque smiles. Ploy's chest tightened. No, I don't want to stay here, I don't. The shadows moved in, the darkness swirling around them. Wynn's voice broke. We can't escape, we're trapped just like them. The shadows began to merge, forming a circle around them, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. Stay with us. The voices were deafening, echoing through the trees, reverberating in their minds. Ploy screamed, her voice raw with fear. No, leave us alone. But the shadows only laughed, their mouths stretching impossibly wide. Wynn's flashlight flickered one last time before going out. Darkness swallowed them whole. The sun rose slowly, its light filtering through the dense canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor. A search party moved through the undergrowth, their faces grim, their voices hushed. They found the campsite, the tents untouched, the campfire cold, backpacks neatly arranged, but no sign of the hikers. The leader of the search party, an elderly ranger named Somchai, shook his head, his eyes weary. Just like the others, his younger assistant looked confused. Others, Somchai's face was solemn. People get lost here, they hear voices, see things that aren't there, and then they vanish, leaving everything behind. The younger man's face went pale. Why does this keep happening? Somchai looked into the forest, his eyes distant. This place, it's cursed. They say the spirits of the lost wander here, calling out, luring others to join them. He took a deep breath, his voice heavy. Once you hear the whispers, there's no way back. They packed up the campsite, leaving everything untouched, just as they had found it. As they walked away, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it faint, distant voices. Ploy, Wynn, help us. The forest stood silent, ancient and unyielding, watching as the search party disappeared down the trail. And somewhere, deep within the shadows, hollow eyes watched and waited.
If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.